Thank you, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed your lunch. So we're going to kick off the afternoon session with the theme of AI creating new jobs and skills. We're going to start off with 3 academic presentations, and then as in the morning, we're going to then hear again from industry. So we're going to have academic presentations from Chris, from Ravish, and from Carlo. And as in the morning, each presenter will talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll get them all on stage for Q&A at the end. So hold your questions till the Q&A. So Chris, if you'd like to take it away. Thank you.
So yeah, while everybody gets seated, a little bit about myself. My name is Chris Michael Hong. I just graduated from Tsinghua, and I'm an incoming assistant professor at Renmin University. I'm in the School of Business, particularly focusing on organizations and individuals in organizations. So this morning, a lot of the topics were focused on a more macro level, looking at the whole economy, looking at companies. My research is at a much more micro level, so we're more concerned about the individual, and hopefully by discussing kind of our research findings, we can shed some light into how organizations are applying AI and using that to augment employee their productivity in terms of their creativity and their novelty. So kind of a motivating question in our research is, from the perspective of a manager, how do we go about effectively implementing AI in our organization? As we were discussing on the industry panel, a lot of the times just having the AI tool itself might be met with pushback from employees who don't know how to use it effectively. So when we're looking to bring this new technology into our organization, what can we do to more effectively implement this? Do we look to get the most advanced models? Do we have to better train, get better data? Or do we focus more on the human side of this? Do we help increase AI adoption? These are all very practical questions where, as organizations with limited resources, we need to consider how to best allocate our time and energy to effectively implement AI to increase our overall performance. So I hope we can kind of step into the perspective of the manager at a more micro level and think about what can we do to improve the performance of employees in our organization. So to make this kind of a more distilled version, we're addressing 2 main questions in our research. The first is, when we're looking at complex knowledge worker type tasks that do not necessarily have clearly defined outcomes. So for instance, if we're looking at tasks such as consulting, management consulting, or writing press releases, or engaging in business plans, for these types of complicated tasks that are not necessarily easily automatable, does using AI necessarily outperform human-only performance? So for instance, on the panel, when we're discussing writing the short story, does the human-AI collaborative story outperform the human-only story? This is the first question. For knowledge worker type tasks, complicated knowledge worker tasks, is it beneficial to use generative AI? And if so, then, what can we do as a manager to marginally increase the performance? Should we focus our efforts, having implemented AI, should we focus our efforts on increasing the quality of the AI, trying to get better data, trying to get more sophisticated models, so focus on the AI side? Or should we focus on investing in the human side, trying to address how effectively humans use the AI? So to address these issues, our research team has opened an AI lab where we have both an on-site component that replicates a business setting where we have people working in an office environment doing these more sophisticated knowledge worker tasks, and also offline, and also a off-site component where we then take our AI analytical tools to companies around China, and we're able to see how workers engage with AI and look at their chat logs and their interaction patterns. So over the past few months, we've gone to companies all over China and worked with thousands of employees, trying to have them engage with their job-related tasks and working towards addressing these 2 main questions of, does using generative AI improve performance, And then what can we do as managers to further increase the effectiveness of AI in our organizations? So we're not just addressing this at the individual level, we've also looked at groups and other types of research questions. But the paper I'm presenting today is our first paper in this series, which focuses on individual level performance. So when we talk about knowledge worker performance, what are we looking at? We're looking at not just how useful the things they're creating are, but we're also looking at the creativity, the innovativeness of their outputs. These type of complicated outputs are not necessarily clearly defined. So to analyze this, we have structured our paper into two tasks. The first task is addressing question number 1. Does using AI collaboratively surpass human-only performance? And the first part of question 2. Does increasing the sophistication of AI marginally improve the human-AI collaboration? So what we did is we've divided these participants who are engaged in tasks such as business plan writing, crisis resolution, marketing plans. We've had them engage in these type of tasks into 3 different conditions. One, where they individually complete the task. The second one, where they use a less sophisticated LLM, specifically ChatGPT 3.5, and then a more sophisticated one where they're working with GPT 4.0. Because we're dealing with these more complicated tasks, there's no clear standard of what is the right answer, what is the correct answer. So in order to assess the outcomes, we have each task independently evaluated by 6 experts, human experts, who assess the performance both in terms of creativity, usefulness, and the overall performance. So this is addressing the first half. Based on this, then work on the second question, where we're looking at, okay, so having examined the effect of modifying the sophistication of the AI, can we influence how effective humans are in using the AI? Specifically, we have a training manipulation where we develop training materials and spend about an hour training the participants on how to use AI. Now, specifically, our training is not just narrowly focused on prompt engineering, which we do cover, but we also train them in regard to a more holistic approach on about how does LLM specifically process knowledge, and how does that differ than the ways humans use knowledge. So in our second experiment, then we have a training manipulation to examine the marginal effect of training on the same 3 measures, which is also evaluated by the 6 experts. So looking at the first experiment then, where we find similar results to previous research where using AI drastically increases performance. That's what I think is quite expected. It's a kind of baseline expectation. And we also find that lower skilled workers or people that have lower scores on their human-only components tended to benefit more from collaborating with generative AI. But the interesting part is when we look at the green and the blue graphs, where we're comparing the more sophisticated and less sophisticated AI models. While we do find that using more sophisticated generative AI does have a marginal increase, we find it's not terribly pronounced. And the next question is how much is this really contributing? So to analyze the contribution of AI sophistication, we engage in a dominance analysis, looking at the explanatory power of the different factors. We find that while AI is able to increase the performance drastically, when it comes to relatively increasing the performance from the baseline of AI usage, increasing the sophistication of the model only has a 10%, almost 11% effect, with the majority of the marginal increase coming from human factors, such as IQ or experience using AI. Now, I clarify, when it comes to no AI versus using AI, there's about an 81% effect from using AI, just having the AI available to you. But if we're looking at, from this baseline of using AI, moving towards better AI, better collaboration, the marginal effect of moving from ChatGPT 3.5 to 4.0 was only about 10% increase in the total change in score. So in this case, it seems to indicate that if we're looking to more effectively implement AI in organizations, humans play a very large role. Now, to kind of understand this, going back to the example of the motorcycle, right? If we're going under the motorcycle and the Zen, right? If we want to use AI more effectively, what are the kind of key driving factors? So if we think about driving a car, if you have a sports car versus an old beat-up SUV, which car do you think is going to drive faster? Well, if it's on a straight and narrow road, perhaps a sports car will get you very quickly to the next point. But when we're working on these more complex, knowledge-based tasks that don't have a very clear parameter for the outcome, and we're looking at these kind of winding roads, going up and down the mountains, going in this creative exploration, the real key is the driver. Driving a sports car, if you're a new driver, is probably less effective than an experienced driver driving the old beat-up pickup truck. So that leads to the next question then. So if humans are important in increasing the marginal strength of increasing the marginal performance of collaborating with AI, how can we more effectively use generative AI? So continue with the kind of the example, right? That's why we have driver's tests. You have to after driving school, you learn how to drive, and that's how you become a better driver. So is it possible that through training, we can also become better at driving the AI? So this leads to our second experiment then, where we see if we are able to train employees to use AI more effectively for doing organizational tasks. And we find that, as again, compared to the base condition, there is an increased performance whether or not there's training. But when we look at the marginal difference between the GPT only and the training case, we find that there is a large influence of training. So once again, we conduct a dominance analysis, and we find that when we vary the model type and then we vary training, the effect of using a more sophisticated AI model, while significant, can only explain 8.5% of the increase in performance. And once again, this is measured across, this is overall performance, but we also measure in terms of novelty, in terms of usefulness. Whereas when we have training, the training is almost double the strength in explaining the increase in performance. So what this seems to indicate to us then is that kind of the true bottleneck is the human side. So kind of going back to our initial question, as a manager, if we're looking to increase and more effectively implement AI in organizations, should we focus more on investing in more sophisticated models, or should we focus on training the workforce to use AI more effectively? Our results appear to indicate that having used AI to get further increases, we should focus more on more effectively using AI. So, okay, if the humans are important and effectively using AI is important, how do we go about effectively using AI then? So while our training materials covered prompt engineering and the more holistic process, we want to have an evidence-backed approach. So our lab allows us to analyze the actual interaction patterns of people and their AI counterpart. We're able to look at the prompts they write, the responses, and how the collaboration unfolds. And by empirically analyzing this, we identified some key factors that contributed to higher scores. In particular, by interacting more, having longer prompts, having deeper questions and further clarity, and also engaging in feedback with the AI. We found that these are some key factors that led to higher scores for novelty and usefulness. So building from this, our next question then is, so if we are looking to more effectively train people to generate high quality human AI engagement, what are the skills we need to learn? Going back to this training, obviously there are industry and company specific factors that need to be considered. What is a specific task? What is your specific role? But are there any kind of fundamental underlying dimensions that translate into more effective human AI collaboration, which we term AI literacy, and it's been a kind of a generally used term these days. So if you look at the middle, right, these are kind of the indicators we've seen that tend to contribute to higher scores. Having technical knowledge, prompt design, collaborating more deeply and effectively. but what skills, what training do we need to give in order to achieve this type of high quality collaboration? So this is some ongoing research that we're currently doing, but we have basically recruited about 200 participants currently, and we had them engage in many hours of tasks. We have them do 18 tasks, and we look for some common factors. Now, not to go into too much detail, but we extract, based on theory, some dimensions, and then we do some exploratory and confirmatory factor analysis. And currently, in our current work, we found that these 4 dimensions tend to reflect what we consider as AI literacy, which is creative thinking, being able to judge the quality of the AI response. Is it hallucinatory, right? And then also, are we able to structure the task in a way that effectively utilizes the AI? Now, having developed these dimensions, we're currently testing them to see if we can use them to explain performance differences. So currently we have 2 tasks, and we've done a business plan task and a creative writing task, but there's still work to be done. And while it can explain a significant amount of performance difference, we're currently working on refining and further developing these dimensions of AI literacy. So to kind of go back to the main underlying question of this session, right? How does AI contribute to new jobs and new skills? Does AI, just having AI, necessarily lead to enhanced performance? Now, at a baseline, if we're looking at no AI versus have AI, then yes, there is a baseline, but that's just a starting point. Going forward, as managers, how do we further increase performance, marginally increase performance? Is it just improving the AI models? So our results indicate that there is not a direct path to improving performance, and rather, goes through high-quality collaboration. So when we're talking about future skills, we argue that a key consideration is AI literacy. And we heard about this a bit during the panel discussion from industry experts, how when we're looking for new employees and we're talking about what skills are going to be attractive to employers, we argue that a key consideration is, can this individual effectively utilize AI? And we highlight that this is different than simply IQ or industry knowledge. This is about, are you able to interact with AI in a way that effectively unlocks and utilizes its potential and integrates that potential with your unique knowledge? So I hope from today's presentation, you've kind of learned to appreciate the value of training and also the importance of being able to really deeply integrate AI at an individual level, using this as an opportunity to further explore what constitutes high-quality AI collaboration and what constitutes AI literacy. So really, thank you so much, and I look forward to further discussion during the Q&A.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to present my work here. I'm actually very excited to be a part of this conference. My name is Ravish Maya. I'm an assistant professor at NYU Stern School of Business. The title of today's talk is The Impact of Large Language Models on Open Source Innovation. This is a joint work with Doron and Gal Ostrander, both of whom are in Tel Aviv University. Now, I live in New York, but until yesterday I was in India, so I took a 24-hour flight to reach here. Now, just in case some part of my presentation is unclear, I'll blame it on my jet lag, okay? All right. So as scholars here, we are all very clear about the transformative ability of generative AI, right? I could replace this word anything with quite literally anything, and the result exists, right? This is at least what I heard from every conference that I attended this year, all right? I'll replace it with something that everyone knows, which is productivity. There are some well-done research which shows there is an impact on productivity. I can replace this with creativity, and then there are researches which have shown in some dimensions of creativity there is a positive impact, and in some other dimensions there's a negative impact. Now, what is important to note is all of this research are on individual productivity and individual creativity. What is unclear in my mind is how does this translate into group tasks, collaborative tasks, where each task can be split into multiple subtasks and many people are simultaneously working on it, right? So basically the fundamental question here is what to look for in a group task when you're trying to measure the impact of generative AI on those tasks. We believe we have a framework which will help answer this question. And towards the end, I will also try to convince you that even if generative AI becomes exponentially better over time, our results will hold. Now let's get our focus on collaborative tasks. Now, most of what people do in collaborative tasks, especially in the knowledge economy, can be split into two different tasks, which is iterative tasks and origination tasks. I'll explain further. Iterative tasks are those where you basically work on top of what others have already done, right? So you take their work, understand what they've done, and refine it in your current iteration, all right? So this requires you to have interpolative thinking, where understanding the existing solution really helps for you to refine the solution in your current iteration, all right? While origination tasks are those where in a project, there is no precedence to that particular task. So you are an architect of that solution. You have to think and conceptualize it from the scratch. So basically what you require here is extrapolative thinking, where you have to come up with the solution and then implement it, all right? So most collaborative tasks is a good mixture of interpolative thinking, which generates inside the box solutions, and extrapolative thinking, which generates out of the box solutions, right? So the intuition that I want to build here is that the impact of generative AI on these collaborative tasks depends upon how much of it requires out of the box thinking and how much of that requires within the box thinking, all right? So to test this intuition, what we need is a setting where people are collaboratively working. Their work can be observed in detail, and there was an impact of a large language model. Right? This is where open source innovation comes handy. We've had talks in the morning about this anyways, and we all know this, but open source is a software development movement where people are collaboratively and openly solving some of the software problems on platforms like GitHub. And why do we as scholars care about this open source? That's because almost all the packages that we use, ggplot2, NumPy, Pandas, all of them are open source, right? And as someone who has been following open source for quite some years, I know that a lot of tasks require people to do iterative things, that is, you are working on top of what others have already done, and origination tasks where you are implementing an algorithm or something from scratch. And as we also saw in the morning, there was an LLM which impacted some of the projects, but not all the projects. Okay, so this open source gives us a very good setting for this, right? This is where I want to speak about GitHub Copilot, which also a speaker in the morning spoke about. This is a programming-focused large language model, which was developed by Microsoft and OpenAI together, right? Now, like everyone knows, there are two major things that GitHub Copilot does. One is code generation. You ask for something like ChatGPT, it generates the code. The second part is also code completion, where it understands the context of what people have typed about the code, and it helps you predict the next part of it. All good. But what is interesting about the launch of GitHub Copilot, which is worth studying? It's the way how GitHub Copilot was launched itself which makes it very interesting, right? So if you followed the timeline, GitHub Copilot was launched in October 2021 through various integrated development environments like JetBrains. When it was launched, they supported programming languages like Python, but they omitted support for languages like R, right? So now as researchers, we all know that both Python and R are data-oriented languages with multiple overlap in functionalities and use cases, right? So this staggered support gives us the natural experiment, okay? So with this background, let's take a look at the two research questions that are of interest for this study. The first one is whether LLMs affect collaborative open source innovation at all. And the reason we ask this question is most of the research that has been done are on guided tasks. They are in the industry setting, and most importantly, it's been shown that it works for low-skilled workers. And in open source, what we see is most of the contributors are high-skilled, and it's unguided. People just volunteer their time, right? So I just want to check whether there is any impact at all. The natural follow-up question is, if there is an impact, is there an asymmetric impact on two different types of tasks that people do in collaborative, that is origination and iterative? And the extension that I want to think about is basically, yes, even if we show the result today, will the results hold after 6 months when a 10 times better model will show up, right? And my definition of LLMs getting better is it makes use of the context better, or it uses the richer context better, right? So I will get to it when I come to this extension part. So whether there is an impact, what type of an impact, and whether this impact stays after 6 months, right? Or when with LLMs getting better. These are the questions that I want to discuss. Now with this background, let's get into what we have done in this project. As I mentioned, we are actually contrasting Python and R packages, all of which are open source. There are over 350,000 Python packages, in which about 2,000 packages are well maintained, in that there is some contribution regularly. So even there are some of them which had extreme high contributions during our pre-treatment period or zero contributions. So we did some filtrations for the Python packages and similarly R packages as well, and we get some numbers here. The next task that we do is basically get the package download data, right? The package update data, I'm sorry. And this we get it from their respective repositories. For Python, it's PyPy, and for R, it is CRAN, right? This is basically the updates, number of times the package has been updated by the package owner. And the third thing that we do is get about 630,000 commits. Commit, I'm sure we all know this, but it's a technical term where anyone who wants to make any code changes, addition or deletion, they need to commit it to the repository, okay? So we got all of these data from GitHub, right, for the packages that were available on GitHub. So, and then of course we do some pre-processing using propensity score matching. And so finally we get about 1610 Python packages and its matched R counterpart. And we get the commits data for a subset of them, because not every package has a repository which can be mapped direct one-on-one repository on GitHub, for example, Apache, right? So to check whether our initial matching is correct, we have a parallel trends graph. This is the leads lag model from Otter, and you can see that before the treatment period, before October 2021, there were hardly any difference between the Python and the matched R package, and after that we have a significant jump. So this shows that the parallel trend works, okay, econometrically. Now, central to our project is understanding what type of contribution people have made on GitHub, right? Because people can be writing some very fancy algorithm, or they could be doing a documentation. And the challenge that we face is there is no clear-cut standardized way to identify what each comment does. So what we do is we take the text comment that comes with every commit. It is mandatory for everyone to add some comment which says what the commit is about, right? So we take the text commit which looks like this, and we take a help of a very smart research assistant to tag this, called GPT-4, okay? So in our paper, we have done, we've explained this in detail, but I'll give you in one slide what we've done, all right? It's a three-step process. The first step is basically to identify general categories of comments, right? So we use the language capabilities of a large language model and the discernment ability of a human research assistant and come up with this 5 categories here, okay? In the paper, like I said, we've discussed this in detail. And this is step 1, categorizing all the commits into one of these, into some buckets which results in these 5. Step 2 is to use a large language model to come up to categorize all the 630,000 commits that we have downloaded. But for that, we need to know which large language model is good. So we benchmarked it against a expert human annotators, right? So basically, we randomly chose about 400 commits, and we asked a human annotator to put it to one of these 5 buckets, 3 human annotators to put it to one of these 5 buckets, and then measured the outcome of these various models against this. What we can see here is that the open source models, at least in this task, have not done that well, and GPT is the OpenAI models have done well. And within the two of them, at GPT 3.5 Turbo and GPT-4, 3.5 Turbo did almost as good. So for cost and time and efficiency reason, we went with GPT 3.5, and then finally we used GPT 3.5 Turbo to categorize all the 630,000 commits into one of these 5 buckets. If we do it today, the names will change: Llama 3.1, GPT-4o, all of those, right? So, and most importantly, we focus on 2 types of commits that people have done: code development and maintenance, because I will explain it later. This maps very well into the 2 types of tasks that I have discussed in the past, the iterative tasks and the origination tasks. I'll get to it in a couple of slides, okay? So if you're interested, this is basically where the SSRN link, this is the QR code for the SSRN link. It's there in the appendix, so you can take a look at all these discussions. And by the way, this is not, we have not come up with this kind of methodology. It's been there in computer science, and this is like an appeal to make use of this. It works like a charm. Okay, so the first research question is to identify whether there is an impact at all. We use the traditional two-way fixed effect model. This is not staggered adoption. So if the matching is done well, the pre-processing is done well, the two-way fixed effect model works, all right? So we use 2 different dependent variables. One is the number of new version release, and the second one, that is very endogenous to the package, and the second one is the number of new commits committed to this Python packages, okay? We also use synthetic difference in differences, which is one of the modern non-parametric matching techniques. And by the way, for non-staggered adoption, this ends up becoming like a two-way fixed effect model with the package level weights and time level weights, okay? So this is the results from synthetic difference in differences. What we see is that the package updates is about 9% higher for Python packages compared to the matched R, and about 33% more commits in Python compared to R. And using our traditional two-way fixed effect model as well, we find the results are stronger, right? 17% and 51%. So basically this tells us that LLMs do work even in open source innovation, which is not a surprise. But what is interesting here is that when you arm a high-skilled worker with the productivity boosting tool, they use it, right? That's a very important point, at least in my mind. The next follow-up question is, how do this affect these 2 types of tasks, right? Origination tasks and iterative tasks. Now I'll spend a minute distinguishing, like building intuition around these 2 types of tasks, right? These are the 2 major types of commits that people do: code development and maintenance. Let's take the example of code development, a new feature development, right? As someone who wants to create a new feature, there is no precedence in my project, right? So I need to think like an architect, think of the solution from scratch, only knowing what the ultimate outcome should look like, and not even knowing how this new feature that I develop will interact with other features in the project, right? So you'll have to be like an architect. So both and once you see the solution, you don't even know whether it's the right solution or not, okay? So basically, this requires you to, this has this vague scope as well as the solution space. But when it comes to maintenance, like bug fix, you know what to do. You know, because someone has already reported the bug in the package, and there's a lot of discussion, you know where to look for to solve the problem. And once you see the solution, you know that that's a solution because the bug is fixed, right? So this has both well-defined scope and solution space. So what the hypothesis here is that at least code development requires you to have out-of-the-box thinking, mostly out-of-the-box thinking, whereas maintenance requires you mostly to have a within-the-box thinking, right? That's why LLMs may have asymmetric impact on these 2 types of tasks, depending upon what LLMs are trained to do, all right? And this is what we find as well. So what we find here is that when there is a boost for origination tasks, which is basically the code development tasks. And I just missed telling this. The mapping is 1-to-1. That origination tasks are code development, whereas maintenance is iterative in that you're fixing something that someone has already done, right? And you see that there is an increase of about 10% for code development, 13%, whereas maintenance is over 24%. Right? This is basically subsample analysis. When you do a triple difference analysis, we find that we have a similar finding, all right? So LLMs do impact both types of tasks, but one of them it's a lot more than the other. Now, the final kind of discussion that I want to have is what to do with this research. What will happen to this research 6 months from now, right? Will the answer change over time? So this is where I want to understand whether having better context makes a difference, or an ability to understand the context better makes a difference. So what we do is we use the existing projects and bifurcate them into two based on whether, as of now, the context availability is better or not. So the simple dichotomy that we do is using the splitting the packages into above and below median based on the activities, because more active packages are more likely to have a better context, more discussions, more better documentation, etc. All right. So we modify the model. It's again, we have a above median dummy, which basically has a value of 1 if it's a more popular package. All right. So what we find is, yes, there is more activity for more popular packages, and this is, by the way, percentage increase, and more popular anyways used to have a lot more activities. But what I want you to look at this is a lot of numbers, but I will explain this in short. That is, for more active packages, the difference between new feature development and maintenance is a lot higher, right? So I'm using this simple finding to basically make this argument. In the paper, we have one more test, right, based on the real better GPT, better GitHub Copilot, showing that this results holds and actually even gets stronger over time. All right. So what I'll do is I'll summarize everything that I've said in a simple tweet. Right. I want you to. There are a few takeaways here. One is that yes, even high-skilled workers use productivity boosting tools and they do well. Most of what happens is basically GPTs work really well when the task requires you to have within-the-box thinking and not necessarily out-of-the-box thinking. And third, that this results, I would persuade you that this result will stay after some time. Now, as a pessimist, when I look at this result, it tells me that, oh, GPTs are only good at some types of tasks, most likely simple incremental innovation. But as an optimist, what I see this from this is that when most of what research has been done is on individual productivity, and I would call most of individual productivity as origination tasks, right? So clearly, iterative tasks are a lot better as per our research, which basically means the real value and real power of LLMs have still not come out through research. Okay. This is where I want to stop my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. Happy to discuss more. And again, the QR code for our SSRN paper. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Carlo Pizzinelli. I'm an economist at the International Monetary Fund. And the working paper that I will be presenting today is a companion paper to a larger report that the IMF published last January, which you can find on our website. And the usual disclaimer applies that what I will be presenting is my opinion only and that of my co-authors, and should not be interpreted as the view of the IMF or its board. The motivation for this work is that AI might trigger a structural transformation of the economy. We might not know yet how large this will be, but it will surely entail a reallocation of workers from those occupations that will be experiencing a shrinking labor demand towards those that will be experiencing an increase in labor demand, and also towards new occupations that have not been created yet. We don't know what these are, but we can actually make some informed guesses in terms of what kind of skills they might require and what kind of workers are more likely to fill them. More importantly, though, this reallocation will occur at different times for different types of workers. There will be older workers who might be affected towards the end of their career, and there are also going to be younger workers who might be affected at the very beginning when they enter the labor market. This means that it will have a different impact on their entire prospective earnings throughout their career. And that's why we should look at it through the life cycle lens, so through the lens of an entire career of a worker. So what we will do in this paper is that we will ask two questions. The first is, how does AI-induced reallocation interact with workers' entire careers and their career growth, and what is potentially their impact on their present discounted value of expected lifetime earnings? And a question that is more at the heart of what the IMF does is also, how does this differ between advanced economies and emerging markets? Most of the discussion today has focused on a few countries, especially the US, but we also had a question in the audience about emerging markets and low-income countries and how this whole discussion might apply to them. So what we will do is that we will take two very standard labor force surveys, one from an advanced economy, the UK, and one from an emerging market, Brazil. And importantly, these two surveys have a panel dimension, meaning that we can observe workers, the same worker across 2 periods of time, and hence we can look at how they transition across different types of jobs. The other thing that we need is a sort of classifications of occupations in terms of what the likely impact of AI on that occupation is going to be. The first part of this classification comes from the literature on AI exposure. Today we had one presentation on a classification of exposure. What we use here is that of another paper by Felton and others. And we complemented with another classification of complementarity to AI, which my co-authors and I developed in another paper. And we use these two classifications to broadly group occupations into 3 kind of bins. One, which is what we call low exposure, is the jobs that are very unlikely to have a significant impact from AI. Then the ones that we can call high exposure and low complementarity. So these are jobs where AI is more likely, or relatively more likely, to serve as a substitute for workers in the completion of certain tasks. And then the jobs that we can call high exposure and high complementarity. And these are the jobs where we can assume AI is more likely to serve as a complementary technology to the workers, so to increase their productivity. And these are also the occupations where we might expect to see more higher labor demand and higher wage growth. What we will do with these two things, so with the data and the classification of occupations, is that we will examine historical patterns of workers' transitions across occupations, so these 3 types of occupations, and see where they happen in their career, and how these transition patterns differ across countries and for different types of workers by age and skill levels. And time permitting, but this is probably not going to be the case, we will do a sort of proof concept exercise where we compute the impact on the present discounted value of expected lifetime earnings from different scenarios of how this reallocation from some occupations to the high exposure ones occurs. So the main findings will be that skills really matter. And actually college-educated workers across UK and Brazil are very similar in the way that they transition throughout their career upwards towards those occupations that are more high exposure and high complementarity. So those are the ones that are more likely to benefit from AI. And in particular, we find young college-educated workers are the ones that make the most upward transition towards these high complementarity occupations. On the other hand, non-college educated workers over their careers make a higher proportion of transitions towards the low exposure jobs. And these also tend to be those with lower earnings. So if we are to kind of identify a group that seems to be both most at risk from disruptions from AI and most likely to reap the benefits from AI, these are the young college-educated workers. And that's because these are the workers that between age 21 to age 35 in both countries make the most transitions out of the high exposure, low complementarity jobs towards the high exposure, high complementarity jobs. We can think, for instance, as to say like paralegals, that one day might become lawyers, one day they might become judges. Paralegals tend to be more like low complementarity jobs, and lawyers are more the high complementarity jobs. So these are high-skilled workers who might be more likely to benefit from AI as they can move more easily into these high complementarity jobs. But to do so, they use low complementarity jobs as stepping stones. So if these jobs get disrupted, then suddenly they might not have the stepping stone that they need to get to the high complementarity ones. And when we look at the scenarios in terms of the present discounted value of earnings, we'll see that there is like wide variation in terms of how different assumptions affect workers of different skills, and especially in the two countries. And what really matters is going to be the relative wages across the different occupations and the relative shares of employment in those occupations across countries. So before I go to the results, I want to give you like a quick conceptual framework that we discuss more in the companion paper on how we classify occupations. Felten and others classify occupations in terms of exposure to AI, where this is broadly defined as the overlap between AI applications and worker capabilities in carrying out certain tasks, or in carrying out the most important tasks of a job. But this classification is agnostic with respect to whether AI will be substituting the worker or complementing the worker. So in the other companion paper, we introduced the concept of complementarity. And here the idea is that some of the high exposure jobs, for some reasons, could be complementary, while others are more likely to be substituted by AI. And we can interpret this as what is the more likely impact of AI on those jobs. But obviously, that doesn't mean that all the workers who are in high complementarity jobs are safe, because you need the skills that are needed to work with AI. So this is more about the occupation, not necessarily the workers within them. But the other thing that is important is that most likely the kind of jobs that will be created will be high exposure, high complementarity. These are the new occupations that will need to have AI, otherwise they wouldn't be created by AI. And to be jobs, they require a worker working with AI, and that is why they are high complementarity. As I said, we discussed this in the companion paper, so at the moment, I'm kind of asking you to take this as face value. But to give you an idea, the kind of factors that we put into this complementarity index are more of a kind of like the social context of what a job is like. So things like the criticality of the job, the responsibility for other people's health and safety, the responsibility for your own decisions and your independence. And again, we can think of the example of a paralegal, a lawyer, and a Supreme Court judge. You know, the paralegal, the lawyer, and the judge all do a lot of text analysis, a lot of drafting, but the paralegal has a lot less autonomy in their decisions. They also take fewer responsibility. On the other hand of the spectrum, you have a Supreme Court judge whose decisions are much more kind of impactful on society at large. So we think that in terms of societal preferences, it's more likely that AI would be substituting for a paralegal than for a Supreme Court judge. And what we see in this graph, when we group all the occupations from ONET into their major groups, is that some occupations like professionals and managers tend to be high exposure and high complementarity. And then other occupations like clerical support workers are high exposure but low complementarity. So these two dimensions, complementarity and exposures, have independent variation, which is important to investigate. Now, as I said, we use data from two countries, Brazil and United Kingdom. The data is fairly standard. It's the nationally representative labor force surveys with a few million observations for each country. And we take kind of like the pre-ChatGPT period, so until 2022. And using these classifications of occupations, as I said, we look at jobs that are low exposure, jobs that are high exposure, low complementarity, and then high exposure and high complementarity. And first of all, if we look at various countries, this is just to show you Brazil and the UK are very different in the sense that UK has much more jobs that are both high exposure, high complementarity, and high exposure, low complementarity than Brazil. Then what we do is that we look at workers in one quarter, and then we look at workers in the second quarter, and we see whether they're in different occupations. And conditional on that, we look at whether they are in a different type of occupation by exposure and complementarity. When we look at non-college educated workers, so low-skilled workers here, if we look at the low bars, basically we see that the blue bars show us that much more workers in Brazil than in the UK tend to move from any job to a low exposure job. So they tend to have this sort of downward moves towards low exposure jobs. much more in Brazil than in the UK. On the other hand, when we look at college-educated workers, we see that the heights of the bar, and in particular the heights of the dark red bars, is very similar across countries. And this means that regardless of where a worker is, a high-skilled worker, when they move to a new job, the relative chances of moving to a high complementarity jobs are very similar across countries. So what we see here is that there is much more similarity in high-skilled workers across advanced economies and kind of emerging markets than in terms of their kind of low-skill or non-college educated workers. But the other question that is important is, when is it that workers are making these transitions upwards or downwards this job ladder? To answer that question, we can use a very simple framework, which is like a life cycle regression, where our dependent variable is the probability that a given worker for a given period is in a certain occupation, and regress it on an age polynomial and some controls, some time fixed effects. And then if you're fancy, you can put on also some cohort fixed effects. But the idea is that the coefficients of this cubic polynomial on age will help us trace the share of workers of a given age that are in a given occupation, and we can sort of trace the average career growth for workers throughout their life cycle across these occupations. And we do this separately for each country and by skill group. So these are the results of these polynomials. I'll walk you through it. So first, if we focus on the UK, the college workers and the non-college workers, what we see, if we look at the dark red lines for the college workers, so that's the green box, we see that workers in their, when they're 20, 21, about half of them are in high exposure, low complementarity jobs, and about a third are in high exposure, high complementarity jobs. Over the next 15 years, there is a large relocation. A lot of these workers move from the low complementarity to the high complementarity jobs. And this is a big part of their career progression that, on the other hand, you don't see in the non-college educated workers, where these occupational shares are much flatter throughout the life cycle. When we look at Brazil, if we look at the college educated workers, we find that they have a very similar career progression throughout the first 15 years of their career. So a large relocation away from the low complementarity jobs towards the high complementarity jobs. And similarly, the non-college educated workers have much more flatter profiles in the share of occupations. And there is also a level difference with the UK, with a much higher share of low exposure jobs. So again, the main takeaway is college-educated workers look much more similar in Brazil and the UK than the non-college educated workers. Part of that is because in Brazil, actually, there is much more kind of people, many more people stop at primary or secondary education, middle school, than in the UK. And again, that in both countries, it's really the young workers that make most of these transitions. Also, if we are to do the same analysis, but for wages within these occupations, once again, we find that it's really the college-educated workers and the young ones that see a very fast progression in wages within these occupations. And most importantly, this profile is steeper for the high exposure, high complementarity occupation. And again, we can think of this as lawyers, young lawyers tend to make a fast, progression from, junior associates to partners. While, I don't know, if you have certain other jobs and maybe you're a construction worker, there isn't the same career progression in terms of wages as well. But importantly, for thinking of structural relocation, this career progression doesn't just come within the jobs, but it also comes from moving to these jobs. So these graphs just show the regression coefficients for a regression where we look at the wage premium from switching jobs. And we find that there's a lot of growth for workers who are in low complementarity jobs or low exposure jobs when they switch to the high complementarity jobs. So we can think that when there is AI-driven structural transformation that opens up more of these jobs, those workers who can make the transition to these jobs might experience a career, like an increase in their income from them. I have very few minutes left, so I'll just give you kind of the proof of concept of how this fits into understanding the total impact that the structural transformation might have on workers' careers. Think of somebody who's entering the labor force today. You can think of their expected income in their next 35 years of their life as being the present discounted value of the probability of being in a given job at a given age and the average wage in that occupation. And now think that we use this framework to make very simple exercises where we say, okay, well, AI destroys 10% of the low complementarity jobs, and those workers, instead of having those jobs, move to unemployment. Or instead, they move to low exposure jobs, or instead they move to high complementarity jobs, so they can actually relocate up. And also we can think of transformation triggering an increase in wages for the high complementarity jobs. And so these are all extremely simplified assumptions, but if you think of all the potential impacts that AI might have, it is some kind of convex combinations of these scenarios. So what we do is that we look at what would be the impact on the present discounted value of earnings of these scenarios across Brazil and the UK, and again divided by non-college educated and college educated. And I won't go through all the details here and all the numbers, but the idea is that the effect of each scenario differs because what really matters is what are the relative wages in, say, the low complementarity occupations compared to the high complementarity occupations, and what are relative to the low exposure ones. So obviously, if in a country like Brazil, the relative wages of the high complementarity jobs are much higher than the low complementarity jobs, that kind of reallocation would spur a lot more career income growth than in the UK, where the wage premium is much lower. So the idea is that it's really hard to generalize what the impact is going to be in terms of total earnings for the workers, because it depends on the assumptions that you make and on the relative wages of the workers and the relative share of employment in these occupations. So I will conclude to say that to recap, it's important to think of the labor reallocation that AI might trigger in terms of its dynamic impact on the labor market and how it might affect workers at different points in their career. We cannot think of it just like as a static exercise where, say, X% of workers relocate from one job to the other. Because for understanding the total impact on a given worker, we have to understand how it plays into their career growth and their average career progression for those kind of workers. But when we look across countries, we actually see that for high-skilled workers, that expected impact is very similar across countries. And in particular, young high-skilled workers are the ones that seem to be most exposed to the benefits, but also most exposed to the risks, because they are more likely to make the transitions in the high complementarity jobs. But those transitions come from the low complementarity jobs that often work as stepping stones. So if those are disrupted, they might have less of an opportunity to move up the job ladder. And of course, there are a lot of caveats with this analysis. It's very partial equilibrium, and it's based on historical patterns, which might or might not continue to hold in the future. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion as well.
Okay, so thank you very much to our three speakers for very interesting presentations. We've now got 15 minutes of Q&A with the audience. So as before, put your hand up and then let us know your questions and who they're directed to. Yes, gentleman in the front.
So thanks to all three for very interesting presentations. My question is mostly directed at Carlo, but others may have thoughts on it too. And it's really about the sort of exposure work in general, but I think it's especially relevant to your new paper, which is, so with all the exposure work, I think about how when you think about technology generally, rates of technology adoption in developing countries have been extremely slow. So in the private sector generally, firms in the developing world are very, very far from the technology frontier, decades, maybe even a century behind in many cases, for a whole bunch of reasons: human capital, cost, behavior, and so on. And so, in these exposure studies, I always think, well, what is different this time to be thinking that the impacts that we could see from quote unquote exposure would take place anytime soon? Because if we just sort of extrapolate from general past experience with technology, it could be several decades before firms, especially the public sector, of course, in developing countries, really adopt AI in a way which it has an impact on the labor market.
Yeah, that's okay. It's a very good question, and I think it's something that other people at the IMF also worked on. And in our report, we talk a little bit more about this. I think the difference compared to other technological waves of technological change is that perhaps the level of infrastructure that is needed for the high exposure jobs to benefit from AI is somewhat lower. So if we think of, well, you need an internet connection, and then most of the technology is actually in another country, that's very different from saying we need to make a transition from agriculture to manufacturing, which requires a lot more infrastructure and much more perhaps of a concerted effort. While if you're like a lawyer or a doctor or even a data scientist in an emerging market, all you need is really an internet connection, cloud computing, so things that it might be easier to get relatively to other types of technology. So it is true that these countries might have a lower share of workers that are high exposure or high skill, so that diminishes their ability to take advantage of the occupation of these new technologies as much as advanced economies. But also it might allow them to sidestep a whole part of the economic development that came in the 20th century that had to go through the kind of manufacturing stages, which require a lot more investment.
And also some sort of experimentations that these private firms are doing in those countries, especially the emerging economies, might change this entire speed at which the high exposure things can come along, right? So it's likely that thanks to some of those technology companies, people will be exposed to this. Especially I'm thinking of AI in my mind, like generative AI in my mind will be exposed to very, very quickly. So things will change a lot.
Okay, maybe over to the next question then. Yes, gentleman over there.
Yes, thank you. Chris, quick and sweet question, short. You mentioned your sample was 200 individuals in one slide. I'm just wondering what age segment of the population you choose from. And if you specify, by what age ranges in particular you got the information from. And Carlo, why do you choose UK and Brazil? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll first answer that. So the 200 individuals were for an ongoing research where we're developing the dimensions of AI literacy. For the two experiments I discussed earlier on, the first experiment had about 500 individuals. The second experiment had about 600 individuals. And they were primarily working professionals. So the age range, we had a couple of retired people attend, but we controlled for age, although it generally tended to be skewed more towards younger people in their 30s or 20 to 30s.
On a question for me, the very simple answer is that when we started doing this work, initially we did the methodological paper, and we were looking at labor force data in the cross-section. So we picked 5 countries for which we had cross-sectional data, and then we thought, okay, we really want to look more into how do workers move across jobs, and out of those data sets, like 2 countries out of 5 had a panel dimension, and those were the UK and Brazil. But the UK is very much on the high end in terms of how many jobs are high exposure, both in the high complementarity and low complementarity side, which makes it very kind of representative of the broader advanced economies. And Brazil was also representative of a broader set of emerging markets where there is still a high level of informality, so there is still a lot of population that has lower levels of education, that doesn't really work in the formal sector. But there is also kind of a very thriving high-tech sector with that is kind of like fed by very high-quality schools.
So my question is primarily for you, Chris. You mentioned the need to build AI literacy in that human-AI collaboration. Can you talk more about what kind of training techniques did you employ within that sample to build these skills?
Okay, thanks so much. So in the initial experiments, we developed our training materials primarily based off of the innovation literature. So we looked at, in particular, there's some research about collaborative innovation. And we talked about, we also used some literature on prompt engineering. But recognizing that this is more based from theory as opposed to data-driven, we then, in this current ongoing research, we're extracting what we consider to be high-performance types of collaborations. And basically, what that involves is we have these participants engage in a wide variety of tasks, and then we capture different dimensions of their engagement, and then we do factor analysis to see what can more effectively, what can predict performance. But that's currently ongoing research, so it's about doing some exploratory factor analysis, but then also trying to do confirmatory analysis based on theory too. So this is an ongoing project. But once again, the first was more data or theory-driven, and now we're trying to do more data-driven construction of literacy.
Okay, any further questions? Yes, at the front here.
Thank you. My name is Omar Arias from the World Bank. Really interesting presentation. Thank you. So I have two questions, and I think mostly go for Chris and Ravish. I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name.
Correct. Yeah.
So the first question is if either in the work you're doing or in the literature, there's any attempt to try to look at what are the sort of human skills that are more complementary to AI and improving performance using AI. Because I think it was in your paper you had IQ, as clearly you measure that, but sort of that's a very rough measure of cognitive ability. I mean, did you attempt to measure, other skills? Or if in the literature that has been attempted. And then I guess whether there are any similar applications to using AI for teaching and learning. And in the school of my kids, the same school, different teachers have very different policies. Some will ban AI or ChatGPT totally. Others would embrace it and say it's okay, and we'll just change the way we teach and assess learning. Is there any research showing, which of the two approaches, and when would it make sense to introduce gradually tools like ChatGPT for teaching and learning? Thanks.
So that's a really great question. And to answer the first part, so I didn't go into too much details about this, but we also measured IQ as well as Big Five personality measures, and we controlled. Also, we have like a work experience using AI. And our goal was to control these factors and see if there's kind of an independent AI factor or AI literacy factor that is separate from necessarily IQ or having an extroverted personality. So we attempted to control for these, but as you see in our slides, a large amount of the kind of explanatory power is from individual factors. So we're trying to figure out just how much AI literacy can really increase in addition to these other kind of baseline factors. Now, what I'm really interested was your second question about training, or about, learning. So I didn't present this today, but one of the companies we're working with, they, not to go into too much detail, but they do 2C sales, in-person sales. So they actually use AI to train their salespeople how to more effectively market. And so it's like a high-end beauty, I don't know how to say it in English, but what they do is they do like microdermabrasion, these type of beauty services, and they found that using AI to train and practice, marketing these products, upselling customers, had a very significant impact on the monthly sales of their employees. And that's some ongoing research we're doing right now.
So I have a related question, Chris, actually. So you also talked about the importance of training individuals to work with AI. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what that training involved, either in your work or what you think that could look like?
Great. So currently, we're currently working on improving our training materials and trying to get more evidence-based background. But to kind of, from our, I guess this is perhaps more of our qualitative experience doing or working with these organizations. At a very fundamental level, there's like prompt engineering. Do you know how to construct a prompt? Are you providing all the right type of background information? Are you telling the AI what you hope it can do? I think that's a very kind of baseline. That's very easy, just maybe half an hour you can get that. But what I think the real kind of potential of AI is when we get to the higher level structuring of the overall collaboration. Are we engaging in convergent thinking? Are we engaging in divergent thinking? Am I asking AI to operate in a more evaluative role where they're kind of reflecting on the overall work? When should I ask AI to try to create these crazy ideas? Maybe there's some hallucinations in there. That's okay. And how do I, as the human, structure our overall collaboration? Because at least in the current versions of LLMs, they're primarily reactive. So when AI is acting in different roles is primarily determined by the human partner in the collaboration. So I think that's a very kind of nuanced and less tangible aspect, but I think it's a real key driver. But once again, we're trying to see necessarily, is there evidence that supports these perspectives?
Interesting.
And
Thank
I
you.
just want to add one thing here, and I'm going to base my answer purely on generative AI. I think this is where I'm trying to answer both of your questions. Generative AI only, right? So there are some papers already which show that generative AI has some impact on creativity, right? And just to give an example, what they say is the number of output per person goes more, right? Number of images that someone can create is more, and it is better than what they used to do before. But overall, when you look at all the outcomes that people have generated, they all start to look similar to each other. So I want to use this as an example to say that there are some types of tasks where you cannot explain AI enough to, no amount of information that you give to an AI will get you an answer that you basically want to see. Creativity is an example there, right? Where I know there are some benefits, but not the kind of best of the best art or best of the best music. So these are the kind of tasks where you can't teach people how to use AI. So these are the kind of tasks where the impact of Gen AI also, at least at this point in time, is limited. I hope that is the direction that you were getting at when you asked the question about the complementary part of AI. There are some other tasks where you clearly can, right? You give better, more context, and the AI will give you a better answer, right? So these are the types of jobs where it can very clearly be used. Teaching is one such example, actually.
Okay, so I think we're definitely out of time for now. I saw there were many other questions in the audience, but maybe you can find the speakers later. So thanks again to our 3 speakers for a fantastic session, and we're moving swiftly on.
So thank you very much. That was excellent. We're moving on to, as in the morning now, hearing from some industry experts now on how AI is creating new skills and jobs. So just over there, they're having a very quick mic swap. So I'd ask the speakers for the next session, so Sam, Brandon, Karen, and Katya, if you could make your way over there, we'll very quickly get your mics up, and we'll start again in about 1 minute.